Public Schools First North Carolina believes that school diversity still matters, so pushing back on the resegregation of our schools is a battle worth fighting. This is the second part of a series highlighting North Carolina's history of school diversity and honoring North Carolinians who contributed to the cause of Black education and school integration. Part 2, the segregation era. When you look at the bigger picture, it's evident that education has been segregated for most of North Carolina's history. There were two eras of improvement, the first after emancipation during Reconstruction, and the second during the Civil Rights Movement. In Part 2, we'll focus on how public education grew but remained segregated during the Jim Crow era. When slavery was abolished after the Civil War, there was great hope for the future of Black education in North Carolina. Establishing freedmen's schools was a top priority for the newly emancipated Black population, and they were supported and run by progressive Republicans and Northern religious groups. Since so many Black families became sharecroppers after the war, agricultural education would become a major focus of Black education in the South. In 1865, the South's first Black institution of higher learning, now known as Shaw University, was founded in Raleigh with funding from private donors and the Freedmen's Bureau. The 13th through 15th Amendments were passed after the war, though they will be undermined for decades by lack of enforcement by the federal government. During Reconstruction, Southern states figured out how to use methods like debt peonage and poll taxes to maintain white supremacy. North Carolina was required to write a new constitution in 1868 before being readmitted to the Union. Former Confederates were temporarily banned from voting, so the Constitutional Convention had a progressive Republican majority, including 13 Black legislators who pushed strongly for education rights, most notably AME Bishop James Walker Hood, who was on the Education Committee. The right to a free public education was added to the North Carolina Declaration of Rights. North Carolina Democrats took back control of the legislature in 1870 and began dismantling protections and opportunities for Black citizens. Unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court was made up of mostly Southern Democrats appointed before the Civil War. They struck down every civil rights and enforcement act passed by Congress to prevent this from happening during the Reconstruction era. Between 1876 and 77, federal occupation of the South ended, and Republicans shifted away from abolition and Reconstruction efforts to the more conservative and pro-business platform of the modern Republican Party. North Carolina Democrats then passed 30 amendments to the state constitution, including legal segregation of schools, which had been prevented at the 1868 convention, the use of gerrymandering, poll taxes, literacy tests, and unchecked KKK intimidation stripped Black voters of all their power. A segregated school system began to take shape all over the state. Even for white students, public schools like this Davidson County Log School started off very small and meagerly funded. In the late 1800s, Black families sometimes accessed private academies like High Point Normal and Industrial Institute through Northern missionary societies like the Quaker Friends. The school was based on the Tuskegee Institute model, and Booker T. Washington recommended Alfred J. Griffin to lead the school in agriculture, masonry, and carpentry training. North Carolina's other significant minorities at this time were Native Americans. In the late 1800s, the federal government began an assimilation policy that involved using boarding schools to separate children from their tribes to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. There were 4 of these boarding schools in North Carolina, including a Quaker-run school for the Cherokee. Some Native American communities further east successfully created their own public schools and teacher training programs. The first was Croatan Normal School in 1887, which eventually became the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. After the Supreme Court overturned the Civil Rights Act of 1875 and established the separate but equal doctrine in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, de jure segregation was firmly established in the Jim Crow South. There were some thriving Black communities, such as in Durham and Wilmington during this time, but in 1898, Democrats organized a statewide white supremacy movement to oppose a fusion government made up of progressive white Republicans and populists. Uproar over an editorial run in a Black newspaper in Wilmington was used as a rallying cry to intimidate voters, circulate false stories, and forcibly remove elected officials in Wilmington and replace them with Democrats. The newspaper was burned, many Black citizens were killed, and prominent Black leaders in the area had to flee and never returned. Meanwhile, the state began to help public schools for white students grow and improve. In the early 1900s, the General Assembly authorized the first appropriations for public education. The school year was extended, teacher training was supported, and rural schools were subsidized. In 1910, public elementary schools were opened for Black children. By 1918, secondary schools for Black youth were opening in progressive urban districts. But between 1904 and 1920, annual spending for white schools was almost 7 times that of for Black schools. And in rural areas, funds that were supposed to be for Black schools were redirected to white schools. With public funding for Black schools so low, private funding was still necessary to provide even the basics for Black students. One of the most notable Black private schools in North Carolina in the 1900s was the Palmer Memorial Institute in Goldsboro, founded and led by Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who was considered a national leader of Black education and later served as president of the state's Black Teachers Association. In the 1910s, the school year had been extended to 4 months, child labor laws were improved to prioritize education, and school transportation was introduced. The state's investment in Black schools increased significantly in the 1920s. However, disparities in per-pupil spending for white and Black schools increased too. The Black community had to invest massive amounts of money, time, and resources into their schools. In 1924, Native Americans gained citizenship and the Cherokee Reservation was reorganized. However, because of the law forbidding whites and persons of color to mingle, the federal boarding schools continued operations long after they were known to be unsuccessful and harmful. At the turn of the century, federal programs had ramped up support for agricultural, vocational, and technical training, especially at land-grant schools like NC State and North Carolina A&T. In 1921, the North Carolina Division of Negro Education was formed to help Black children in rural areas. Black educational leaders like Charles Norfleet Hunter stepped up to teach, train teachers, and serve as principals of Black schools across the state. He helped found the Barry O'Kelly Training School for teachers and students of industrial and vocational trades. Since the Reconstruction era, Booker T. Washington had been heavily involved in recruiting donors and educators across the South. His most lucrative partnership was with Julius Rosenwald, the president of Sears, Roebuck and Company. By 1932, Rosenwald had provided matching funds to help local districts build over 5,300 school buildings. As you can see in this map, North Carolina was a major recipient of these funds. Black leaders across the state tirelessly lobbied for the matching funds to build Rosenwald schools in their local communities. Even Rosenwald schools still lacked funding for teachers, so they relied on another source established by a Quaker named Anna Jeans to hire supervising teachers. Black educators, leaders, and businesses worked together to fund and staff the schools with Jeans teachers. When the Great Depression hit, local school districts were running out of money, so the General Assembly passed the School Machinery Act in 1931 to use a new state sales tax to provide education funding to counties. As part of President Roosevelt's New Deal program, schools were built and more child labor regulations helped the schools near textile mills. The New Deal started the realignment of Black voters from the Republican to the Democratic Party because it did so much to help the poor in comparison and thus better serve their interests. However, FDR did not want to push civil rights during this time because he knew it would split the party. But the Democratic Party was starting to crack in the 1940s as federal agencies and courts began to signal stricter interpretation of the 14th Amendment. Under the leadership of John Collier, the Bureau of Indian Affairs shifted away from assimilation policies and emphasized self-sufficiency and sovereignty, providing funding for community day schools on tribal lands and creating bilingual resources so Native American students could learn their tribal customs and languages. New federal court decisions also required equal salaries for Black and white teachers and struck down segregation of Mexican American and white students. One of the most significant effects of federal programs of the 1930s and 40s was their reinforcement of racially segregated and unequal schools based on neighborhood school assignment and the relationship between property values and local school funding. Federal housing projects were segregated, the GI Bill subsidized white flight to the suburbs, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation's redlining maps created a financial disincentive for white families to share neighborhoods with Black families. By 1946, North Carolina had added the 12th grade, raised the compulsory age to 16 years old, extended the school year to 9 months, and provided increasing amounts of funding and regulation. So by the 50s, North Carolina's public schools were stronger than its religious private schools, which were also lagging behind other states. The expansion of Black high schools with well-trained teachers was challenging, but important due to the limited opportunities Black students had for higher education. The North Carolina Teachers Association, which would later merge with the North Carolina Association of Educators, was the heart of professional development and advocacy for Black educators. Notable NCTA presidents included Rose Douglas Aggery, who had started as a Jeans supervisory teacher, and James E. Shepard, who founded the college that later became North Carolina Central University. After President Truman desegregated the armed forces and showed support for other civil rights actions, the Democratic Party began to split over the issue of desegregation with the national election of 1948. And then in 1951, a U.S. Court of Appeals decided in McKissick v. Carmichael that the University of North Carolina must desegregate its law school because there was no separate but equal Black law school with accreditation available, leading other specialized higher education programs across the state to begin desegregating. Just a few years later, in 1954, the Supreme Court overturned the Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal doctrine with the landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education. The court opinion stated that segregated education is inherently unequal, even if tangible factors such as facilities, teachers, and resources were equal, which of course they weren't, taking it an important step further than the McKissick decision. However, the court did not specify when, how, or to what extent school systems must desegregate, leading to a decades-long battle for compliance. In North Carolina, segregationist leaders like State Senator Samuel Ervin and Governor Luther Hodges, along with white citizens' councils in local communities, immediately began to mobilize in response. Within 2 years, there were more than 250,000 members of white citizens' councils in North Carolina to intimidate and incite violence against integration supporters. The Pearsall Plan, initiated by the governor, passed by the General Assembly, and authorized by statewide voter referendum, gave local communities multiple tools to avoid desegregation. So how does this history relate to our current situation in North Carolina schools? Because tax-funded public resources were divided so unequally, it forced Black schools to need private funding too. Though white philanthropists made sizable and invaluable donations, the majority of private funding for Black schools still came from the Black community and required tireless fundraising and organizing efforts. The more North Carolina pushes private school vouchers and charter schools now, the more will be required of families, nonprofits, and religious institutions that don't have the educational expertise or oversight as the public schools. One of the key characteristics of the segregated school system was that it relied heavily on private education funded and run by religious and charity organizations. This was true for Black schools as well as poor rural white schools that also had woefully inadequate resources. Today, urban and rural schools are bearing the brunt of insufficient public education funding and have more challenges in creating high-quality alternatives than those in the suburbs. The push for desegregation was a joint effort of people of different races, ethnicities, regions, social classes, and roles. So we need all hands on deck, leaders, educators, parents, and concerned community members, to push back against the resegregation trend we've seen over the past few decades. It will take more than wishful thinking. It's going to take a coordinated effort of political, legal, and economic pressure. Learn more about school diversity at publicschoolsfirstnc.org. Stay tuned for Part 3, Integration and Resegregation, 1954 to Today. See the video description below for a full list of references and sources.